Okay. Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here, and really nice to follow up on the wonderful speaker, Madam President, that we had before. And I'm looking forward to getting into this next conversation. We often, I think, talk in the United States about how to lead our own adaptation to climate change, how to reduce global emissions. This is a conversation about how to bring the rest of the world into that conversation, and what needs to happen in countries that are not as economically powerful and dominant as the West. So emerging economies, they face a very tall order, fostering economic growth and development while simultaneously mitigating and adapting to the impacts of climate change. This is really a difficult squeeze. So small and poor nations, they're often the most vulnerable to climate impacts because of either their relative size or their geographic location, or both. They have the furthest to go to build both their economies and their resilience to climate threats, and the fewest resources with which to do it. And they often hold very large levels of sovereign debt as well, debt that's accumulated due to their circumstances, to the pandemic, to mismanagement, but also to a growing degree to the costs of climate damages themselves. So for many of these countries, the fastest way out has been a reliance on resource-intensive or extractive industries. Those industries contribute, of course, to greenhouse gas emissions and to their own environmental degradation, and in many cases only serve to further their vulnerability to climate change. So how can these nations grow and adapt and even seize on the expansion of green technologies and new economies at the same time? Can they leapfrog unsustainable practices, implement innovative green solutions, and drive sustainable and inclusive growth? This is basically what we're here to talk about this morning. So we're going to here to talk about these strategies and policies and technologies that can help emerging economies achieve sustainable development are our four distinguished panelists. So I'll introduce you. Andrew Steer is the president and the CEO of the $10 billion Bezos Earth Fund. He's the former president and CEO of the World Resources Institute, and before that, among many other roles, he was the World Bank's special envoy for climate change. Katherine Ko is an alumni of the Kennedy School and Harvard's Business School. She's a principal investment officer and global climate lead for infrastructure at the International Finance Corporation, where she's been instrumental in growing climate resilience as a focus and criteria of the IFC's work around the world. Cristina Duarte, am I pronouncing that correctly? Cristina Duarte, she's the UN Undersecretary General and the Special Advisor on Africa, and she's long worked on development in both the public and the private sector in Africa. She was a member of the UN's High-Level Advisory Board on Economic and Social Affairs, working to implement the UN Sustainability Goals. And among other roles, she served on the board of the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, which works to scale up local and subsistence agriculture. And Ricardo Hausmann, known to many of you here, is the founder and director of Harvard's Growth Lab and the Rafik Hariri Professor of the Practice of International Political Economy at the Kennedy School. Before Harvard, he was, among many other roles, chief economist of the Inter-American Development Bank and Minister of Planning for Venezuela and a member of the board of Venezuela's central bank. So it's really quite a privilege to have these four folks here. All right, so I want to start with a little scene setting, not to be too rosy-eyed about where the world sits at this moment. Rapid climate change is now underway. Global emissions continue to rise. The world appears to be racing past the Paris goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, tracking towards somewhere in the range of 2 degrees, 3 degrees or more of average warming. So Andrew, I want to start with you. What's your honest assessment of where we stand right now? How do you personally, how do you professionally, running this fund, find a productive path forward? How do you avoid being nihilistic and actually inspire forward progress?
Wow. Well, you don't start with the easy ones, do you?
This is the easy one.
First, look, thanks to the Kennedy School and the component parts thereof. This is a great idea, and please keep doing this every year. It's an honor to be here. And as we heard so brilliantly from the president this morning, as we seek to help emerging and developing countries, one has to do that with great humility, and one has to start by doing one's best to understand things through the eyes of the citizens, especially the less fortunate citizens in those countries. We live at the moment in a state of sort of incredible cognitive dissidence. We are failing at the moment. One of the things we do at the Bezos Earth Fund, we run something called the System Change Lab, and we monitor the 50 transitions that are needed this decade and next. And all of them are off track at the moment. And that's the bad news. And they range from things like, you know, getting rid of the internal combustion engine over the next 15 years, reducing food loss and waste by 50% this decade. One could go on, reforming the financial system so that it actually takes environmental risk and opportunity into account. There are about 50 of these. Sounds like a lot, but if you think about it, you would pretty quickly come up with 20 or 30, and go to the website of the System Change Lab and you'll see the ways that we think about that. So that's the bad news, we're off track. The good news is that actually, even while, for example, the green hydrogen economy is almost nowhere at the moment, you know, it's sort of it's going along the bottom, so you think, my goodness me, it's going to take 1,000 years before green hydrogen, and green hydrogen you basically make from the sun and water, so it's really great if you can do it. The issue is the following, though. Over the last 10 years, the technology required for green hydrogen, something called electrolyzers, the price has come down by 70% of what it needs to come down to before you get that tipping point. So what we're in the business of doing is anticipating those, what in the United States we call hockey sticks, that are out there, positive tipping points. And what we as a philanthropy need to do is get in the mix, and of those 50, say, which of them are stuck in the mud, and what would it take to unstick them? Which are approaching a tipping point, but actually there are some barriers, and we would inject our resources and our energy to removing those barriers. So that's how we think about it. But as we're approaching COP28 at the end of this year, the Secretary General of the United Nations actually said he's worried that this could be the obituary of the 1.5 degrees. Now, if that happens, we've all failed, as the President said this morning. We absolutely need to keep that 1.5 degree alive. And so we need to both honor the failing that we are in now, but at the same time create a spirit of hope and optimism, which it seems to me is exactly what you're trying to do here at this conference.
Thank you. Ricardo, kind of building on that, what does it mean to build a green economy? How do emerging economies have an opportunity to help us meet that 1.5 degree goal? And do we typically think about the opportunity of emerging economies in the correct way?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the question. Hello, everybody, and everybody from the rest of the world. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I think the way you frame a question has a lot to do with what ideas come to you when you want to execute. So the way the world has framed the question is, we are emitting too much CO2. We have to lower the emissions. So every country has to lower their emissions. They have to decide how much they are going to lower their emissions, a nationally determined contribution. Every company has to lower their emissions. Every city has to lower their emissions, and so on. And that's one frame. So ask what you can do to lower your emissions. Look at where you're emitting, and right. The alternative frame is to say, look, the world wants to lower its emissions. That is a major transformation of many things that the way the world produces energy, the way the world manufactures, the way the world transports itself. It's a major transformation to a global economy. What can your country do to enable the world to lower its emissions? Don't just look into your navel and say, my emissions, no. What can you do to enable the world to lower its emissions? Because that enabling of the world to lower its emissions can be your next source of livelihood. That is, you're going to live off of the world's desire to decarbonize. So I'm super excited that there's this major push to encourage the world to decarbonize, and the world is going to have to spend a lot of money in the process of decarbonization and the energy transformation and so on. But remember, whenever somebody is spending money, somebody is making money, right? Income is equal to spending. So who's on the income side? Who is going to be producing the things that the world, a decarbonizing world, will need? And I would put it to you that it is extremely important for countries to explore those opportunities in their growth strategies. They need to think, okay, what is a decarbonizing world? It's a world that's going to electrify anything that can be electrified, and it's going to have to make that electricity in clean ways. Well, that is going to require a ton of metals and electrolyzers and stuff. Who's going to make these things? Well, the metals come from minerals, and the minerals come from mining. Who's going to mine the stuff? Now, we all would wish that countries stop being so extractive, but the truth is that there's no way of saving the atmosphere unless we scratch the earth. And we need to have a mining boom to support the decarbonization agenda, and countries have to figure out, can they play a constructive role there? Right now, with this emphasis on your own national determined contributions, we're inviting Bolivia to the next COP meeting to tell us what they plan to do to lower their emissions. When Bolivia is sitting on the largest lithium reserves in the world, and they have yet to extract the first ton. That makes them poor, that makes the whole world poor, that slows down the energy transition, because with current supplies of lithium mining, the price of lithium went from $5,000 to $70,000, and it just makes the transition more expensive. So I think the way for countries to frame their contribution, especially small countries, if they lower their emissions to zero, the atmosphere will not notice. But there are many things that they can do that will facilitate others lowering their emissions. And I just want to say two more ideas. The first one is, in a decarbonized world, energy is not going to be so easily traded as it is now. That is, right now, oil is so exquisitely dense from a volume and a weight point of view that it has made the energy world sort of flat. The price of energy is the same everywhere. And that allowed energy-poor countries like Japan, Korea, Germany, Belgium, etc., to have comparative advantage in energy-intensive industries. So you have all of these countries, major importers of oil, major exporters of steel. In a decarbonized world, energy-intensive industries will have to collocate with cheap sources of green energy. That's going to imply a reallocation of productive activity. Europe is a very, very energy deficit region. They have to import a lot of energy right now. Part of the adjustment is not going to be that they're going to now import green energy. It's that their most energy-intensive activities will have to move out. So these are opportunities that developing countries need to seize on. To seize these opportunities, they have to ask what things the world is going to need. They have to figure out, can they become the most competitive source of green energy to attract these energy-intensive industries? And they have to figure out how they can become carbon sinks.
I want to hold a minute before moving on, especially on your first thought. And I just wonder if you can offer a little bit on what you think is needed from a global leadership perspective to encourage countries to see the potential that you're describing that they might have in their resources, to give permission, as the case may be, for certain types of extraction to continue in an era where I think that we tend to think of climate progress as moving away from any kind of environmental harm. So does the UN framework, does the global COP framework support adequately the kind of development that you're talking about?
Well, I mean, as the Growth Lab, with the countries we work with, we are exploring these opportunities in detail. And I think before you need too much international cooperation, these countries are agents of their own destiny. They can figure these things out for themselves. And that's the first message. take a look at your opportunity set and see how you can play your cards. How you can make mining attractive with secure property rights, environmentally sound, etc. But the more attractive you make your place, the lower the cost of capital, the more you will be able to extract in the forms of natural rents. But right now everybody talks about climate finance. So there's finance if you are going to substitute a coal-fired power plant for something else, you're home. But there is no finance to finance what is needed to install the capacity to solve the world's decarbonization needs. So I think that the frame at COP28 should change from just your own national determined contributions to really help countries become significant players in the supply business. And there, I would say that right now we have protectionism in the US, protectionism in Europe. They want the world to decarbonize, but they want to be the suppliers of that stuff. And I think that we have to involve the rest of the world in the supply of these things. That's going to make them more enthusiastic about the energy transition because, if that's your growth strategy, you want the rest of the world to decarbonize because you want your market to expand. But it can't be just that we're talking to people's morality and so on. We have to solve the incentive problem.
Thank you. It's a perfect lead in for my question for you, Christina, which is, none of this comes easy. And I'd like to hear a little bit from you, from your perspective of what you're observing in Africa, of what the trade-offs are that you see countries facing as they look to grow, knowing that so much of that growth depends on some sort of environmental harm, often depends on extractive industries, exacerbating climate impacts. And I think you have some examples in Nigeria in particular to talk about, but how do you see African nations, developing nations in general, striking this balance?
Thank you very much. Good morning to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. And please understand me. I cannot miss this opportunity to squeeze Africans' position. Because the global discussion, the global debate has been systematically marginalizing Africans' position. So allow me to grab just this opportunity as an African. To discuss climate in Africa is not possible without putting energy in that same conversation. If you discuss only climate, green transition, and I'm going there, 100% that conversation will be biased, distorted, and will pushing Africa to the corner. In order to avoid that, any conversation about climate in Africa should bring also at the same time a conversation about energy. Allow me to provide you a couple of numbers, and I'll be quickly, Abraham. Africa has only 17% of the world's population, but represents only 3.3% of global primary energy consumption. Only 1.1% of electricity generation, 3% of global energy use in industry. We have 600 million people without electricity in the 21st century, and we need to generate 18 million jobs annually. Otherwise, we'll be in trouble, or we'll continue being in trouble. Let me put this in perspective, these numbers. In 2019, the European Union consumed over 3 times as much energy as Africa. 3 times more. France and Germany combined energy consumption in 2019 equal Africans' consumption. So, with all my due respect, we need to bring some fairness to this process. So don't use a climate global narrative to put Africa in a straitjacket, because we'll not be able to deliver equality. The UN's driver slogan, to leave no one behind, will be just far away. So, and I do believe that these are the numbers that should be considered. Or, in other words, Abraham, if we want really make this planet green down the road, we need 2 things. First, we need to recognize that so far we have been unable to build an efficient mutual accountability framework. Completely. And the numbers, the results. Why I say so? If you notice, if we squeeze the mutual accountability framework, what we have? We have advanced countries putting billions on the table. But they know they have no conditions to deliver. But they keep putting billions. And you have African countries putting dozens of commitments that require billions. And African countries don't have the fiscal space to deliver the NDCs. This is an efficient mutual accountability framework to address an urgent matter in our planet? I don't think so. And I do believe that if we need to factor Africa's specificities into this conversation. So I do believe that in order to move ahead, we need to factor this. How? I do believe that Africa, each African country is entitled. I'm entitled as an African. As you were 20 years ago, I don't know. My country is entitled to undertake its own energy planning. Please don't tell me, oh, when you are doing your energy planning, that you should not consider that. No. I'm entitled as African, each African country is entitled to undertake its own energy planning, define its own energy mix, and in this process, to put in the table all energy sources, with all my due respect. Because our starting points are not the same. I'm in this chair. I'm already in this chair. I'm Africa. I'm already in this chair. I contribute with 3.8%. I'm already a green continent. On top of that, sorry, I'm already there. On top of that, I'm a carbon sink. I'm helping you guys. So, and you tell me how I can transit if I'm already there. It's not possible. Just to tell you that this narrative, the energy transition in Africa, sorry, with all my due respect, we need to reshape. Okay, we put just, the word just, to make it more closer to Africa. Just energy transition. We can deal with that, no problem. Just energy transition. But at least recognize that we have different starting points. The same destination. The same destination. I agree with you. We all need to deliver that green point down the road. But don't tell me that our starting points are the same. You already have energy access. So I can understand that you need to transit. I don't. So my problem, what should drive Africa from a policy-making standpoint, should be energy access. And I have all the sources in my continent to do it. Now I ask you, how come, if I have all the sources, how come Africa is the darkest continent in the world? How come you are transforming my carbon credits in commodities? So you buy cheap and sell expensive to manage the pace of your green trajectory. And in another stage, you tell me, please, fossils now, coal now. And I have 80 million jobs to deliver. So these are the contradictions and the trade-offs that needs to be discussed in an open way. And give space to Africa to factor in its own specificities, its own challenges. We have been a dark continent in the past 60 years. I can tell you enough is enough. We are not going to be a dark continent in the next 60 years. And the African position that has been approved last year, it's clear. Do we want us to be in the table, to continue the table with this conversation? You'd better listen Africa and factor in their specificities. Thank you for the opportunity.
There's a lot to unpack there. Yeah. That's wonderful. Thank you. And obviously, equitable development is such an important part of this conversation, and how the world, the inequality in how the world has gotten to where it is now, and bringing equality into what happens as we go forward. But hearing the concerns that you're describing, what makes it attractive for Africans to get to a cleaner economy on the other side of the problem that you're describing? Is there, this perhaps is the leapfrog opportunity? Is it a question of having adequate finance to expand that fiscal space that you mentioned? Is it a question of, as Ricardo says, embracing extractive industries that further global climate goals but don't work against global emission goals? What's the opportunity that makes Africans excited about going forward?
Abrahm, I need to tell you that I'm very scared when someone mentions leapfrogging. When I see leapfrogging, I just see international pressure for Africa to do much faster, much better, but you have not done. So I get a little bit scared. Having said that, Africa can do it right. I'm not saying that we can't. We can do it right, and you have the responsibility to do it right. Again, because we are in a green position. From a technical standpoint, not ideological, not political, but from a technical standpoint, it has been proved that for Africa to put itself in a sustainable green path, Africa needs to invest in the next 10 years on a power-based. Has been proved technically. See Nigeria Energy Transition Plan to 2060. Is available. And you see that Nigeria Energy Transition Plan, in the first 10 years, calls for an increase in non-renewable energy sources to build the power base. Once Nigeria is that level, Nigeria will be in a position to start building, in a sustainable way, a green path up to 2060. I would love to project. It's clear. So, from a technical standpoint, even the global narrative of putting Africa on a straitjacket doesn't make sense. Then we go what Ricardo said, that the building of an energy path, at the end of the day, is an economic growth opportunity. There are lots of business. But studies in Africa have realized for Africa to move, as you know, Africa is again supplying some critical minerals for some these green global trends, electric vehicles, you name it. For Africa to move the needle, to use that opportunity, as you mentioned, to move the needle in the global value chain, Africa needs to access to a huge amount of energy. Much more than mining. And they are telling me that I can do that with the window. It can't be. So even the global narrative, when it's convenient, does not factor in technical positions. When it's convenient. So I believe that in the case of Africa, it's clear. And you see the projects that are in the phase of implementation. We are conscious that we have the same destination. But please, don't ask us to pay the whole bill. And don't ask us, you cannot do that because we need time to decarbonize. It cannot be in this way. It cannot. Because at the end of the day, we have 600 million people without electricity. It is amazing. When I was born, Africa was with millions of people without electricity. I'm 6 years old. And we still have 600 million people without electricity. Something is wrong. Something should be wrong. Can we reset? Back to you, Abrahm.
Thank you. Katherine, thank you for being patient. So you get a two-parter to get us going. I mean, I'd like to hear, because we're talking about, from a development perspective, hard infrastructure. First of all, I mean, what is it that you see, what types of projects, what specific projects, if you want, are most important? And secondly, and particularly in the context of Christina's comments and of Africa, but the whole world, I mean, how can developing countries access the financing that they need to close the infrastructure gap that they face? What are the pathways to tap into climate financing for infrastructure in particular? And what are the obstacles that developing countries still face in getting that climate finance?
Thank you. So first of all, it's really, really good to be back on campus. It's an honor to have this discussion with all of you today. Really actually glad to see this type of conversation happening at the Kennedy School, because I've been actually in multiple conversations throughout this past week. And so many interesting conversations about the issues, opportunities, innovations that are happening in the US and in developed world. And not much conversation about the developing world. And actually, I find it a little bit problematic to just call global south or developing economies, because there's just such a wide range of economies within that category, right? And I think it's already illustrated very well in what Christina said, what Ricardo said, etc. Is developing countries are dealing with problems at multiple levels, right? So access to basic infrastructure services like electricity and water. And then you have the issue of growth, right? And then the next level is sharing the global level responsibility. Dealing with all the these different level of issues all together is actually a daunting challenge, right? And they are all in different places. So just calling somehow the global south and talking about only bigger economies, who the U.S. and the Western world actually wish for them to share responsibility with, and then somehow lowest income countries that are viewed by the Western world as somehow at the receiving end of some humanitarian support. I don't think that's representative, right, of this developing world that we are talking about. It's really a wide spectrum of economies and problems that we are talking about. So I work at IFC. I'm the global climate lead for our infrastructure and energy business. IFC, I think last year dispersed 33 billion US dollar, and half of that goes to financial institutions, but the other half goes to real sector business, including infrastructure businesses, but also manufacturing, agriculture, and services, etc. So we invest. We are one of the leading investors in emerging markets across multiple sectors. And here, what we focus on I think first and foremost is development impact, right? And development impact is, about growth, about provision of basic infrastructure services and improving people's well-being, and most importantly, growth, right? Without that, you don't achieve that. So IFC's investments focus on achieving that with ENS, environment and social safeguards, right? So that each of the investment is done in a way that doesn't cause harm from environmental and social perspectives, and various risks have to be managed well, right? So that actually the investment works. Why? IFC is a multilateral development financial institution, so there's this perception that maybe it gives concessional financing, but that is actually not the case. All the investments that we do are done on a commercial basis, right? The mission of IFC is not to just keep giving money, but actually demonstrate that commercial investment can be done and sustainable, right, in developing economy, and bringing other capital, especially private sector, to go together with us, right? And then we keep repeating that until we are no longer needed. And then we have to go to a more difficult economies and do the same, right? So that's our mission, and which is why we do investments on a commercial basis. Now, here, I think the point Professor Hausmann made is really key, because when we look at where the growth comes from and how do we manage the risk, climate is now affecting both the risk side and the opportunity side. right? So if we are going to do investment in a sound way, climate is key risk, from a credit risk perspective, ESG perspective, etc. But opportunities, where is the growth to come from? Now it's going to be climate and sustainability, because the world is moving into that direction, right? So before you can think about, I'm just going to grow without thinking about this part, but now no longer can you do that, right? So which is why, when we look at now where we are investing in emerging markets, it's these so-called green economies, right? Green economies, green opportunities, which are going to drive the growth of the economies. And a growing part of our work is actually helping companies figure out, right, how they should transform their business so that not only they just manage the risk, but actually they can capture those growth opportunities. If I may, talk about like concrete examples, for example, Poland is a coal-dominated economy, and they really need to transition out of coal. But so they are adding, solar PV and other projects as well. But the demand, right? The demand for electricity is such that you cannot just add a little bit of solar PV and wind, and then it can actually replace that. So the offshore wind industry, it is something that they consider as an alternative, and they've been working on it so far. But it's a completely new industry, right, that did not exist in their country so far. So creating a new industry in a country takes a huge effort, well-coordinated effort from, with multiple stakeholders, and large size of capital, because offshore wind projects are, not just small projects that you can, do. It's very similar to actually oil and gas project in terms of the capital required, the complexity of the risks, etc. So going forward, this industry is going to be one of the growth engines that the country will be relying on. But how do you get it right? And for this kind of effort, multiple stakeholders, of course, the government, the EU, the World Bank, they will all, they are actually helping the government to figure this out. But individual company, right, international developers who are going into the country, they have to do this. It's a climate opportunity, so they're going to capture this opportunity, but they have to do it in a way that it takes into consideration the just transition aspect, right? And they have to do their share. They have to manage that aspect so that it's well received within the local economy, so that they can develop the supply chain and other aspects of the the industry, right? So that it makes business sense for them, but also takes care of the just transition part. So this is there's a growing need for our work in helping companies to figure things like this out. So this is another part of the work that we are, seeing growing rapidly. And now, to your second question about how can emerging economies access finance better, right? Climate finance better. So, throughout this week, again, I hear this statement about, financing is not flowing into emerging markets, right? Climate finance is not flowing. And so how can you raise more money? How can you de-risk, etc. I think it's all good, and more money is good, but a fund, once raised, has to be deployed, right? Has to be deployed. And as of now, at least based on our experience in emerging markets, right? More funding would be great, but do we have a strong pipeline of investable projects in emerging markets? And that's where we actually struggle all the time, right? It's not like projects are ready, to be financed usually in emerging markets. So you have to go much earlier than the review for financing stage, and actually have to make the project ready, make the enabling environment conducive, right, to actually eventually be able to get financing down the road. So this is where I think, starting from a decade ago, but much more recently, IFC is putting a lot of resources and effort going into, we call it so-called upstream. If you go into the IFC website, and you see a lot of this, mention of upstream, because without effort at upstream, really cannot actually, because the money, you can raise the money, but how are you going to use it if the project is not investable? Eventually, you are not going to be able to see the result, right? So So putting a lot of resources and efforts at this upstream stage is what we are doing a lot actually these days, but it's very resource intensive, right? Time consuming and resource intensive. Most of the impactful projects that we've done so far in Africa, scaling solar projects where we helped to deploy solar projects in African countries, for the first time at a very competitive race, and now it's going to Uzbekistan. We helped, Belgrade city to transform their largest landfill plant in Europe into something that's more sustainably managed waste treatment plant. We are now working on providing financing for solar PV projects combined with the battery and energy storage projects. All of these, every single of them required upstream effort for several years, right? And then plus use of blended finance to help de-risk, right? The early nature of these investments and some convening by IFC and others, right? To make this happen. So how can emerging economies, access climate finance more going forward? We have to be able to do a lot of this to create a more bankable project, and that requires funding and more resources. And I think that's how do we get there, right? How do you get that blended finance and other funding resources, for this type of a purpose? I think that's one of the key questions, not the only one, but one of the key questions that we need to solve. I'm happy to talk more about it, but I'll stop here. Yeah.
All right. Well, so time is going quickly. We're going to get to about 10% of my planned conversation. But before we move on to questions, I want to kick it back to you, Andrew, for a moment to build on maybe what Katherine's saying. What's the role of philanthropy? Your fund is helping to aid in the transition to clean energy. And I wonder if there's a role in particular in kind of that early stage seeding that builds the pipeline that we're talking about. So your thoughts on that and more.
Yes, indeed. And by the way, I hope we all agree with Christina that the starting point, if we're seeking to play any role to be helpful in Africa, should be access. And there should be no preaching from Western countries as to what you cannot do. And if there is, it needs to stop right away. And the question really is, how then do those African countries bring electricity to those 600 million that don't have it? And some of them are choosing to use coal, not many, almost none are wanting to do that. Some are choosing gas, and a growing number are choosing to use renewables.
Exactly.
And that's very exciting. And some of them are doing exactly what Ricardo is saying, is thinking really strategically. So where should we produce green hydrogen? Namibia, for example, which you've been working in, is a fantastic place. And other countries are thinking the same. North Africa is saying, actually, we want to get out of the fossil fuel business. We want to become the biggest exporter of green electrons. So now the flow of electricity goes across the Strait of Gibraltar into Europe. They're selling green electrons to Europe. Now, Africa needs a lot of its own green electrons. But what we can do as a philanthropy, and what IFC can do, and what the intellectual leaders can do, and what the UN can do, is we need to figure out where is our role to be helpful. So, for example, in Africa, what's the real problem of renewable energy in Africa? It's not that if we got the prices right, it wouldn't make sense. It makes huge sense. The problem is that the average African developer of renewable energy has to pay 25% more than any other continent, and 150% more for long-term battery storage. So a lot of this comes, for example, from China, and the question is, why are Africans paying so much more? And the answer is lots of small packages. So we, together with the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, which is Rockefeller Foundation, IKEA Foundation, the Bezos Earth Fund, we are financing a major new push with the World Bank, with the IFC and others, to get rid of that gap. That would mean pooled procurement, for example. We're working with the Nigerian government on that. It would require standard setting, because if you're a middle-sized developer and you've ordered a whole bunch of electric panels from China, and you open the box and they don't work, what do you do? I mean, it's such a complicated. So actually, if you think through the process, customs is another set of issues. So the way we think about it is, okay, let's think about a movement here. Let's set ourselves a goal that 3 years from today, African developers will not pay anymore. And we know the ingredients of that. None of us can do it on the end ourselves. So we in the Bezos Earth Fund, we put like $50 million into that kind of initiative. So that's how we think about how do we inject funds thoughtfully. Another sort of inspiring thing that Africa is doing right now is realizing that actually molecules of carbon dioxide up in the atmosphere are causing a lot of harm. Why not bring them down to Earth through the magic of photosynthesis? So instead of being up there, they become part of trees and bushes and crops and soils. And instead of bringing death and destruction, you bring life and vitality. And you actually can double food production. You can create food production that's more resilient. You can, and by the way, it helps solve climate change. That's not why to do it. That's not why Africa should do it. It should do it because it's an incredibly smart thing, because farmers need carbon. So what we've done is work together. We put another $50 million together with the African Union and together with a number of countries, including DRC, including Kenya, and a couple of others, to advance what we call Africa 100. Let's see if Africa, as the African Union has now committed, 34 countries at the head of state level have committed to green 100 million hectares by 2030. Totally Africa's goal, totally Africa in the lead. What can we do? We can provide some de-risking, and also we can support the governments as they're going to make sure that as we bring these molecules down to Earth, we don't do it in an unjust way. We have to see everything through the eyes of those poor farmers that are going to benefit. So yeah, we have to be quite sort of forensic in terms of where we put our resources, because $10 billion in grants this decade sounds like a lot of money, but actually it has to be used very, very well. And every single dollar that we provide as a grant has to do two things. First, it has to do the first order things that whoever our grantee has promised to do in whatever part of the world they're doing it. Second, it has to be part of creating a movement for real change as we head towards these sort of irresistible and unstoppable tipping points.
Thank you. Let's take some questions, I think, from you all, I hope. Please.
Hi, my name is Karim. I'm a fellow here at CID. For a long time, development main goal has been to reduce poverty. Now, in many forums, green transition is presented to mean development by itself, as if green transition will lead to reducing poverty and solving all the other problems. So my question is it time to acknowledge that development now should have two fundamental goals? One is green transition, and the other remains to be reducing poverty. And maybe the policies needed for each of them are not the same, so that we are not confusing the two concepts together and thinking about how really to achieve the two goals simultaneously.
Just to repeat. Yeah, I'll repeat the question for those listening remotely. The question is, have we for too long conflated the idea of development for social and economic progress and development for a green transition? And should we now, is there a new impetus to separate those two tracks and think about them differently?
I think that if you frame the issue as reducing a country's emissions, then you're asking for a trade-off between how fast you can reduce emissions versus how quickly can you achieve other goals. I think that this may sound a little bit old-fashioned, but I think that the evidence is there. Countries that grow have exports growing more than GDP and have exports being transformed towards more sophisticated, more complex goods. That's the experience. I mean, exports and growth in the world in the last 40 years has been export-led. So if you ask a question, how is it that countries are going to participate in the global economy in a way that they can bring income into the country, participate, etc., then a decarbonizing world is a world that has different demands from the current world. It's going to have very fast-growing industries, and it's very important that we help countries tap into those fast-growing industries. That's going to propel their movement forward. That's going to be their leading exports of the future. That's going to be what's going to bring in fast income into the country. That's what's going to allow them to import more and so on. So if framed in that way, I think green growth is a good frame. It's using the world's desire to decarbonize as a source of dynamism for your economy. By the way, just a small commercial. On August 2025, we are leading an executive education course on these green growth opportunities with Professor Dan Schrag and other faculty here at the Kennedy School, precisely to help countries figure these things out, where they can participate in a greening world in a way that will make them money.
Thank you.
I would agree with that. I mean, it seems to me that we should not be separating them. We should rather see economic development through the eyes of the people that are going to benefit from it. And it turns out that there's huge overlap in the Venn diagram between a green future and a prosperous future. And that we haven't talked about adaptation, but if we do not take adaptation seriously, we will undermine all of the progress that we've seen. The example I gave of landscape restoration is just one of 100 one could make. And it's a bit like the old debate, should we think of economic growth as one thing and human development as another thing? Well, at one level, yes, you need to be an expert in education or you need to be an expert in fiscal policy. But no, actually, we now know that actually human development is part of growth and vice versa. And as an example of that, linking it to climate change, when we think about adaptation, if you've got $1 million to spend on adaptation, don't buy cement and build another wall to prevent flooding, although that's a good thing to do. Use it to educate children, because what we're going to need is flexible people that can be ready for the economy of the future, to seize the opportunities, but also to avoid the tragedy that we have at the moment with regard to the impacts of climate change.
You both had thoughts on this question.
You can go first.
Yeah, I think so I fully agree with both, and I think one useful concept may be thinking of this as transition. So, poverty alleviation is important. As let's say, in country, in order to lift people out of poverty, they really need electricity, right? So that's needed. Now, I think what's different from before is we'll now really think hard about, are there any alternatives than just resorting to coal or resorting to gas, right? If there are other alternatives and we can make that happen, we will choose those alternatives, right? Instead of just resorting to whatever was doing before, because of now this climate lens that we are looking through, how we can rid of poverty, through that lens, right? And if you don't have any alternative and you must rely on transition fuels, right? That is fossil fuel based. We need to recognize that there is going to be a transition, right? It's temporary. You cannot rely on that, forever, right? So there has to be a plan to transition out of that, even if you don't have any alternative as of today, right? So I think these are different types of thinking. I think that we did it before, but I think now, because of the change, I think at the world, scale, world level, that we really have to deliberately think through the climate lens for, even if we are going for poverty alleviation and economic development.
Christina.
Very quickly, I do believe that managing development is not managing poverty. These are two different animals and require two different sets of policy measures and frameworks. Africa, everybody is aware that from 2000 to 2015, Africa narrative was Africa rising. Everybody remembers. Growth rates of both 6%. Despite 15 years or 20 years of persistent economic growth, Africa was not ready to external shocks. And now we are again almost from scratch. No fiscal space, begging for debt reliefs and debt suspensions. I do believe that that period, the framework was managing poverty, not managing development. Because to switch or to shift from managing poverty to manage development, there are a couple of ingredients that you need to put in the table. The first, you need to recognize that you need to move away from rent-seeking approach. Second, you need to move from stock management approach to flow management approach. Third, you need to recognize that if you don't build an internal driven sustainable development, you will not deliver development. What I mean for internal driven sustainable development? At the end of the day, do you want to deliver development on a sustainable way? You the better control your economic flows, your financial flows, your fiscal flows. As we speak, when you close our day today, do you know how many millions of dollars Africa has lost? Only today, 240 million. Because I can go on. Africa loses on an annual basis $77 billion in efficient public spending, $88 billion in illicit financial flows, $46 billion in inefficient tax incentives. And you have $1.3 trillion in pension funds outside Africa feeding others' development. So don't tell me that I'm not rich from a financial standpoint. I'm rich. I have money. So Africa has the ability to generate flows. Africa has not the ability to mobilize them. These are two different. If you think that your starting point when designing policy making in Africa, that Africa has not the ability to generate flows, you are in the wrong track. You are in the wrong track. Because if you see, okay, Africa generates all these flows and is losing, because we cannot only lose something that you have, otherwise it is difficult. Africa has not the capacity to mobilize them. We need to stop and ask, what is missing? May I tell you, in my opinion? Institutions, country systems. At the end of the day, institutions do matter. It's not only bridge schools. I will finalize with that. I'm from Cape Verde Island. I used to say that I'm from a virtual country. We have no population. We are a neighborhood in Boston, maybe. No population. We have no water. We have no commodities. We have no market. We are more sea than land. We are more fish than human beings. That country starts its journey in 1975 with a GDP per capita of $190. That same country, has been graduated to a middle-income country in 2008 with a GDP per capita of $3,800, policy and institutional-driven basis. So Africa has reached a situation that needs to invest, and I do believe that African partner needs to realize, invest in country systems, help that same African countries get control of their economic and financial flows, so starting delivering development much beyond poverty reduction. And if you do not do that, we'll not address another hot issue in Africa, stability, peace and security. Situation is becoming burning. Why? What is the root cause of the increasing instability in Africa if we squeeze the lemon? The absence of the state. Everything else are band-aids. Do you want durable peace, you'd better deliver development. And the state needs to be there. So if you agree with that, support African countries, build strong country systems, let's say, as a byproduct, delivers peace and security, which is not bad as a byproduct. Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you so much. This has been such an exciting panel. My name is Mara Bolis, and I'm with a social enterprise consulting firm called Value for Women. In the 90s, I was working for now the GFC, but at that time it was OPIC, and underwriting various energy-related infrastructure projects around the emerging markets. And I went on a due diligence trip to Bulgaria. We're underwriting a project there, and only now I reflect back in those meetings with government ministers and with a private sector actor who was taking up the project, that I never once asked about what disproportionate benefits or risks there could be in this project for women. And now I think it's so clear to me that there are different, right, workplace conditions, there are different workforce opportunities, there are different effects in terms of displacement, there are different community effects. So how do you think about that? How do you do planning that looks at gender inequalities and to prevent negative outcomes and to try to offer positive solutions that disproportionately, that seek to equalize gender imbalances?
So the question, just to rephrase it, is how do you think about, when you look at development projects, how do you think about gender inequalities and particularly the risk of projects expanding risks to women in terms of workforce conditions and treatment in the workforce?
I think we have to do it for every project that we're engaged in. We even are interested in who's running the NGO we give it to. Yeah. We need to know that. And then we need to ask the question, if I'm coming back to the example I gave before, 100 million hectares of land in Africa, we need all of our grantees, and by the way, there will be thousands of them because restoration done right happens at a very small scale. And so we need some pretty thoughtful approaches to make sure precisely what you're saying is occurring. So I think there's been a lot of progress since you worked for DFC, but nowhere near enough. So you're absolutely right. And by the way, I mean, we need to look at all of our projects through the eyes of all of the potential beneficiaries, or those, hopefully, no one will suffer because of them. And obviously, gender is a starting point, but so too, indigenous people. We've just made a grant of $9 million because we think that carbon markets in the Amazon are unfair. As we go in as developers of carbon markets to protect the Amazon rainforest, it's basically governments, local governments, central governments, it's the developers themselves that want to share the revenues, and that's not right. Who lives there? It's the indigenous people. So what we're doing is we're financing them so they can have legal aspects taken care of, that they can make sure that they are part of the sitting at the table, so to speak. So it's not just sort of the idea of doing assessment of gender impacts or impacts of black, brown, or indigenous people, for example. It's going one step beyond to empowerment so that they can be drivers of the program in the first place.
Let me take a slice of what you asked about in terms of gender inclusion. Our studies have looked very much at sources of exclusion, and the labor market, the formal labor market, is one of them, because transportation costs tend to not vary too much by income levels. I mean, a car is a car, gasoline is gasoline, etc. These have the same price everywhere. The lower your expected wage, the higher the transport cost vis-a-vis your income. And the lower your expected wage, the farther away you have to live because you cannot afford a better location. So people in urban areas tend up being excluded from the labor market. And here there's a very important gender dimension. That for women, the opportunity cost of being away from home, farther away from home, 2 hours commute time in one direction, 2 hours back, excludes them de facto from labor market. We did a very interesting study on Jordan, and there we found that the only women who work essentially are university graduates, and when you ask them how do you get to work, they drive their own car. When you ask the few women who work with a high school education or less, and you ask them how do you get to work, they walk to work. So that is, if you cannot afford a car in a city that is poorly structured with bad urban transport, you are de facto excluded from opportunity. So as we think of a greening world, as we think of new cities, as we think of new transportation mechanisms, I think that the inclusion into the opportunities of the labor market in a secure and decent way is a fundamental dimension of inclusion, and it's going to be expensive.
Katherine, you want to add?
Yeah, so gender is actually one of the strategic priorities for IFC, along with climate. And we see that it's emerging as a really big agenda as well, right? Not just within IFC, but globally. We approach that as both opportunity and risk, right? So because we look at every single investment from environmental and social perspective, we've been looking at the social the risks and social impact of our investment anyway and manage that aspect. But now with this climate change coming into picture, we know that women in developing countries are some of the most vulnerable to the impact of climate change, right? So if you are going to manage the climate risk to the project, right? You must consider the gender aspect and manage that as a risk management, right? But opportunity side is that when we work with the clients, we can actually help them, and we do, help them look at their gender practices. How many, female employees do you hire, right? How many, female executives that do you have on your senior management and board? What is your training and other support for gender-based violence, etc.? Do you have adequate support for those? So this is actually a key value add that we provide when we work with a client. Our clients don't just want financing from IFC, right? What they want is this type of value-added advisory expertise. So that's what we do for many of our financing these days. One example that I want to mention is, I don't know if you have heard about this new instrument emerging, is a sustainability-linked financing instrument, right? So you can make companies and help actually support them to come up with a KPI that they will commit to. And many times it will be a climate or environmental related KPI that they will commit to, but you can also add a gender KPI that they will commit to. And if they meet the KPI, you give pricing discount, right? Depending on how they meet the KPI. So this is the essential, I think, part of the sustainable linked financing, which is really becoming really popular, right? It really gives the companies to meet their KPI. Now, important thing is to set the KPI right? If it's just any KPI, then it wouldn't. It has to be material. It has to be ambitious, right? It has to be verifiable. So, which is why. In order to use this type of instrument, you need a certain expertise to be able to structure these instruments right, but it could give a really incentive, for companies to do better and do the right things in this aspect.
I'm afraid we're out of time for more questions. This has gone incredibly quickly. I wish we had another 6 hours to continue the conversation. An incredible collection of knowledge and experience in you four, so thank you for joining us today and for doing this.